Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. We've got a bit of time here at the beginning of this episode, so I wanted to quickly go back and note something about an item name I've been wanting to bring up for a while now, but haven't found the chance. What I'm talking about are blood vials, the Japanese for which would literally translate to something like transfusion blood, or maybe blood transfusion liquid. And the reason I've been wanting to bring this up is because I think it's a great little example of how perfectly reasonable choices in the wording of a translation can subtly shift meaning. Blood vial sounds natural, it fits the image used to display the item in our inventory, and the action associated with using said item. But I think to some degree the Japanese does put more emphasis on the blood itself. Basically, I consider this another interesting example of yet another way in which things can inevitably get lost in translation, even if that translation is a good one. But now that we have another item we've just picked up, I think we'd better switch gears here and start focusing on that. Lake, a carol rune that transcribes in human sounds. This transcription of the Great Ones in human voices ripples like a watery reflection. This rune means lake, and those who memorize it enjoy reduced physical damage. Great volumes of water serve as a bulwark guarding sleep, an augur of the eldritch truth. Overcome this hindrance and seek what is yours. So as you've probably come to expect, there are a lot of interesting things going on here. The point that I'd really like to focus in on, though, occurs mainly in the latter half of the item description. So, I've talked before about genre and how Bloodborne, at least at the beginning, seems to fit nicely within the category of gothic horror. But I also mentioned that the game ultimately makes a move into a more Lovecraftian style of cosmic horror. And it just so happens that this item description gives us some of our strongest clues yet that this transformation is going to take place. And I think the translation brings this out nicely. What do I mean by this? Well, first let's look back at a specific line in the official translation. Great volumes of water serve as a bulwark guarding sleep, and an augur of the eldritch truth. To me, this immediately calls to mind the Lovecraft story, The Call of Cthulhu. In it, we learn of a great old one known only as Cthulhu. It's a creature that lies sleeping at the bottom of the ocean, and the mere sight of it is said to drive people mad. Also, in the story, Cthulhu and the other great old ones are said to speak to men by molding their dreams. So the idea of great volumes of water serving as a bulwark guarding sleep, viewed in this context, is given a potential double meaning. It could mean that the water protects the sleep of the creature beneath the depths, and it could also mean that water protects the sleep of men from such a creature's interference. The idea of carol runes being transcriptions of inhuman sounds is another Lovecraftian parallel, but at this point I'd like to focus in more specifically on the translation. In particular, I want to pay close attention to the phrase Shimpi no Maebure. Shimpi, the first of these terms, literally means something like divine secret or holy mystery if you break it down into its component characters. The actual definition from my Daijisen Japanese dictionary is a mystery so profound it cannot be grasped by human knowledge, something which transcends normal understanding or logic. So that's Shimpi. Maebure, the second of the two major terms in this phrase, has the rough literal meaning of before touch, and it refers to a precursor or premonition of something. The whole phrase, then, is getting at the idea of a portent of unknowable wisdom. Fittingly, the official translation is an augur of the eldritch truth. And what I think is a particularly nice touch here is the way this phrasing evokes some of H.P. Lovecraft's style, just as the concepts themselves allude to his work. The word eldritch in particular is closely associated with Lovecraft in the popular consciousness. So the translation itself is furthering a connection that the game is making. And I could go on, but we have more runes to discuss, like this one. Formless Oedon, a secret symbol left by Carol, runesmith of Bergenworth. The Great One Oedon, lacking form, exists only in voice, and is symbolized by this rune. Those who memorize it enjoy a larger supply of quicksilver bullets. Human or no, the oozing blood is a medium of the highest grade, and the essence of the formless Great One, Oedon. Both Oedon and his inadvertent worshippers surreptitiously seek the precious blood. So as you can see, the official translation is a pretty straightforward one here, but there are still a few things about it I think are worth discussing as I head into this boss fight. First, I wanted to point out how well the official translation does filling in references that might otherwise come across as too vague. The final line, for instance, literally ends with a description of people secretly seeking that out. So what exactly is that referring to in this instance? Well, it seems pretty clearly to be the blood that is a high-quality catalyst and also Oedon's essence from the previous line. Rather than being vague and carrying over this odd use of a reference, though, the official translation fills this in, giving us the line, "surreptitiously seek the precious blood." You can see this at a few other points in the translation as well, and I think it's a wise choice. Also of note from that same line, the English refers to Oedon with the masculine his here, though the Japanese does not make that same specification, something I thought worth mentioning if only in passing, since it serves to reinforce the point I made in the previous episode about the old hunter bone. Finally, I wanted to note the difference between the opening line in the official English as opposed to the line in the original Japanese. A literal translation of the latter might be, "one of the Carol runes that serve as phonemes of inhuman voices." Yet the official English translation opens with, "a secret symbol left by Carol, runesmith of Bergenworth." Interestingly, as we saw when we were looking at the lake rune, there actually is an equivalent phrase in the English translation for the original Japanese. That would be a Carol rune that transcribes inhuman sounds. And I bring this up only because I think it helps to reveal some of the circumstances the translation likely took place in. Most likely, whoever was translating these lines had a whole list of runes to go through all at once, meaning it would be relatively easy to get one of the two standard opening lines on the Carol runes mixed up with one another. It's pure speculation on my part, of course, but that could explain the mismatch here. In any case, that's more than enough on runes for the time being. Instead, I'd like to comment a bit on the boss battle we're engaged in, because this is a rare instance of a fight that has a translation choice right at the heart of the way it's set up. Here's what I mean. This boss's official English name is the Witch of Hemwick, and at first glance, this might seem like an entirely unremarkable translation for Hemwick no Majo, the original Japanese here. But the thing is, there's actually more than one witch in this room. The single health bar with what seems like a singular boss name makes you think you're only fighting one main enemy when instead you're fighting two. It's a trick that really works in both languages, but there's an extra wrinkle here that I think is especially interesting. In part, it's a product of the fact that the English and Japanese languages treat plurals differently. In Japanese, nouns generally don't take plural forms. Majo could refer to one witch or to several witches. So in Japanese, the boss's name, Hemwick no Majo, is merely playing on your expectations. There could be one boss here, or there could be several. Generally, the singular is assumed unless there's a clear context or some special qualifier. But in English, especially with the use of the definitive article the, this boss's very name becomes a deception. Of course there can only be one boss in here because this is the Witch of Hemwick. But even with the different ways each language treats plurals, I don't think it's necessarily inevitable that the English come across as something of a deception. What if, for instance, the boss were simply called Witch of Hemwick? By removing the definitive article the, you don't signal as strongly that this is the one and only witch there could be in the battle. You're in a situation arguably more similar to the one created by the Japanese name, where the player is likely to think that there will only be one witch, but when the reveal of the second one takes place, it's clearer that the player has simply misinterpreted the information rather than been confused by it. And since, as you'll see, the second witch is eventually revealed to have an identical boss name at a separate health bar from the first, there's also less confusion later about there being more than one The Witch of Hemwick. Now, I can't say for sure whether or not it was an intentional choice to call this boss The Witch of Hemwick. It's possible that the Japanese in question was just part of a long list of boss names with no contextual information to signal to the translator that there was a special trick to this one. Or this may have been a decision where someone, or perhaps a group of people, looked at all of the information and deliberately decided to go for a more deceptive name. Maybe the idea is that together these two hags make up the Witch of Hemwick, an identity comprised of two individuals but greater than either, similar to how a hag coven works in Dungeons & Dragons. But either way, I think the existence of these different possibilities serves as a good illustration of how even slight changes in wording can affect the player experience. Also, I think it's clear that the avoidance of the term the Witches of Hemwick plays a big part in how this battle functions, at least the first time through, which is one of the reasons I find this to be a really unique and interesting fight. Sometimes I think it's a shame this is such a relatively easy boss, since there are some really cool ideas that are at play here. But anyway, now that we've finished with the witches, I wanted to take a moment to briefly explain our route from here to the end of the episode. I realized at about this point that I'd forgotten something in Old Yharnam, so after we finish exploring here, we're going to spend the rest of the episode headed back to get that. It's less than ideal, I know, but at least it will give us an extended opportunity to go into some translation choices on the way. And speaking of which, why don't we take a look at that item we just picked up? Rune Workshop Tool. Runesmith Carol, student of Bergenworth, transcribed the inhuman utterings of the Great Ones into what are now called Carol runes. The hunter who retrieves this workshop tool can etch Carol runes into the mind to attain their wondrous strength. Provost Willem would have been proud of Carol's runes, as they do not rely upon blood in any measure. So, there are a few interesting things about this translation, and one of them I intend to come back to as we make our way through Old Yharnam. For now, though, I'd like to focus in on one concept in particular, the burning or etching of these runes into your mind. In the original Japanese, the verb used to describe this process is yaku, which in this context means burning. Combine this with an image of the actual tool itself, something that reminds me of nothing so much as a branding iron, and I think you get a good idea of what the picture is meant to be here. It seems like somehow you're almost literally burning these things into your mind. This process is not actually the same as etching, though. In traditional etching, you cover a metal plate with wax, scratch off that wax in the form of a design with a pen, and then allow acid to eat through the exposed metal. The actual tools required for the process would be different, but one of the definitions of etch is to impress something deeply into something else, and having something etched in your mind is essentially the same as having it burned into your brain. So there's something to mull over as we stop to say hi.
Ah, the hunter. Thank you. So that old man, you told him about this place, right? Well, he don't offer me much in the way of conversation, but still, I'd rather see him alive anyhow. And I sort of hope that my asking you turn out to, help him out in the end. I've never been any use to anyone, you see. Just happy about it, is all.
Alright, and since that's all there is for new dialogue, I'm just going to talk over this repeated one. In any case, the main thing I wanted to look at with this dialogue is the way the official translation brings out a causal connection that a literal translation might cause you to miss. From about the midpoint of the dialogue in question, our friend there ventures to hope that maybe, however indirectly, he's been able to help people. My literal translation of the line in question was, and it makes me think that maybe even I, who asked you for this favor, maybe even I was able to be of some help. This does kind of convey the idea that he's happy to have been helpful, even if only in asking us to look for sane survivors. But I think the official version does a much better job at bringing out the logic that's at work here. It reads, and I sort of hope that my asking you turned out to, help him out in the end. So now, rather than referring to himself as I who asked you for this favor, and hoping that in this aspect of himself he was helpful, he's stating directly that he hopes his asking us for help was a good thing. It's a lot clearer, and I think it's a good way to deal with a common aspect of Japanese speech that sounds pretty clumsy when directly translated. That is, making a long statement modifying the subject I, and using that to form a sentence. But the clarification goes beyond just this one statement. In the official translation, the chapel dweller goes on to say, I've never been of any use to anyone, you see, just happy about it is all. And I think this is great because it highlights his self-deprecation, which kind of got skimmed over a bit in the translation of an earlier portion of his dialogue, and it emphasizes that the reason he's feeling happy is because for what he believes to be the first time in his life, he was able to be of some use to someone, however indirectly. Compare that to the more literal, it's the first time in my life that that's the case, Oh, I feel so happy. And I think the official version ends up being a lot stronger because of the way it brings out the particular logic that connects all these statements for that NPC. I think it's a great example of translating sense for sense rather than word for word. Also, on an unrelated note, I thought it worth pointing out in passing that this is another instance when the Japanese text itself never specifies a gender for the person who is saved, though the English makes use of male pronouns. That's completely warranted given that this is a reference to the narrow-minded man, but I wanted to point this out again in order to continue to illustrate how this is a fairly common feature of the Japanese language. But now, before we get to the end of the episode, there was one last thing I wanted to point out regarding the translation of the Rune Workshop Tool, because I think it emphasizes something I brought up even earlier in the episode. There's a line in the official translation that reads, "The hunter who retrieves this workshop tool can etch Carol runes into the mind to attain their wondrous strength." Here, the Japanese term for wondrous strength is Shimpi no Chikara, and that term Shimpi is one we've seen before. Think back to the translation of the Lake rune, and you may recall that the phrase Shimpi no Maebure was used as part of that description, and the translation used on that occasion was an augur of the eldritch truth. Now, though the word Shimpi is being used in both of these cases, it's important to point out that it's being used as a different part of speech in each instance. In the first case, it's being used as a noun, the eldritch truth, and in the second case, it's being used as an adjective, wondrous. Yet even so, the official translation adds in the adjective eldritch even when the Japanese term is in the form of a noun, meaning that if there was a reason to draw a connection between these two uses of the Japanese term, eldritch could have been applied in both cases. So what am I getting at with all of this? Well, two things. First, it's entirely possible that in a translation, the same source word will be translated in more than one way into the target language. And second, I think this emphasizes the decision to use the term eldritch in the Lake rune as a way to reinforce a potential connection to Lovecraft. That's all the time I've got for now, though. As usual, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, I'd love to hear them. Thanks for watching, everyone.